Happy Friday, everybody. Yesterday, after you took the reading quiz, each of you were assigned a section of an excerpt from George Kennan's famous Long Telegram, or the X article that appeared in Foreign Affairs magazine. Some of you took the time to kind of dig into who Kennan was and what the circumstances were a little bit. A lot of you noted that he was a diplomat, but not just a diplomat. He was the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union during World War II. So, given that we were allies, this in theory should have given Kennan some pretty great insight into the inner workings of the Soviet Union. So, when you're thinking about analyzing a document, make sure we're not just identifying people by name, but what the significance of their name is, what their position is. So, he was a Soviet diplomat. The publication, again, and a lot of you noted that it was Foreign Affairs magazine, not just a Foreign Affairs magazine, but the magazine is called Foreign Affairs. This is not the kind of magazine that most families have delivered to them in the mail, back in the days when people had magazines delivered by mail. This is not Time or Newsweek or casually read things. This is a publication that is designed for foreign policy professionals. So for the most part, average family members don't sit around and read Foreign Affairs. This was directed to people who worked for the United States government. So again, the significance of the source is really important here. It's not the general public that's most likely reading Foreign Affairs. These are policy professionals throughout the United States government. So I want to hit just a couple of the really key points that you guys noted from yesterday. The first section, Kennan did a little bit of psychoanalysis of the Soviet Union, and his conclusion was the Soviet belief in the ideas of communism, and again, this started back with Karl Marx, who was not Russian, he was German in the mid-1800s, was that eventually capitalism was destined to fail, as fewer and fewer people controlled more and more of a nation's assets, of its wealth, of its income. Eventually, the larger and larger number of the proletariat, the poorer people, they would eventually rebel against the system that did not serve them. And the key implication of this for Kennan was that Soviet leaders absolutely believed that this is how history would proceed, which meant that time essentially was on their side. They did not have to be in a hurry to win, which would allow the Soviet Union to act with great patience during the Cold War. They didn't need to rush in a history that, in their mind, was predetermined. Second important idea was that the Soviet Union was controlled by a single party, the Communist Party, but this party allowed no dissent within the Soviet Union. There weren't other political parties. Part of the reason that the Soviet Union did not allow for religious liberty is that the church often provides dissent to what governments have to say. And so they couldn't allow the church to exist and give people an idea that there's another way other than what they are providing. So Kennan's belief was that on the surface this appeared to be very strong, but in fact it's actually very fragile. If you think to your Alice training, if you can, we haven't done much of that this year, but one of the discussion points was if you needed to escape a classroom through a window, how would you break it? Well, if you recall, one of the things that they noted is if you hit the window with a hard object right in the middle of it, that's actually not the best way to break a window. Because in the middle part of the glass, it's actually a little bit flexible. It'll move and it will give, and it's less likely to suddenly break. In fact, the best way to break a window is to hit it towards the corners, where it appears to have more support. It's more rigid, but when you hit it with something, that rigidity is actually what makes it weak. And this analogy applies to the way that Kennan saw the Soviet political system. What appeared on the surface, this rigidity, eventually would be its downfall. Third major point, a bunch of you noted, was that the Soviet economy after World War II, that was rapidly trying to catch up in industrialization, and it actually was actually not serving the Soviet people very well. Kennan's belief was that there was a limited time that people would accept an economic system that did not generally serve them. So we saw the Soviet economic, again, on the surface strength actually as weakness, as other parts of the Soviet economy suffered at the same time. Fourth big point, he said, eventually this is going to turn into some kind of economic crisis. And the Communist Party is going to have to kind of wrestle with the problems. All governments have to wrestle with problems. And what this will most likely do in the future that there's going to be a point in time in which there's going to be a competition for power amongst people within the Communist Party itself. And this public competition for power, especially if it involves kind of reaching into the masses to see what their wishes and their desires are, will show that this system that appeared so strong on the surface is actually already fractured. And that what appeared to be strength is largely an image, it's a facade. And this will cause public support for the Soviet government itself to begin to crumble. So the strange thing about the idea behind Kennan's containment is it's exactly the opposite from what he thought the Soviet Union thought. That it's not capitalism that is ultimately doomed to fail, but it's the communist economic system under the Soviet Union and also the Soviet authoritarian style of governing. That their inflexibility eventually will be their downfall. Now, this still doesn't explain what this has to do with containment, because on the surface, and I saw this in a few responses yesterday, this seems to suggest the United States just needs to wait around for the Soviet Union to collapse. But that is not what Kennan thought. We're going to hit a couple of the highlights that he introduced in the last paragraph that was not assigned to anybody. And it's here where he advocates this idea of containment that becomes the centerpiece of American foreign policy for the next 46 years. So, first of all, if you look at the very top stanza there, I've bolded one particular statement, and this is the fundamental idea of Kennan's containment. It said that the United States should confront the Russians, confront them with unalterable counterforce at every point where they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. In other words, the Soviet Union is going to look to expand. They're going to look to expand physically, geographically, and also with their influence. Kennan's idea was they must be confronted or contained everywhere this takes place. This is not a passive foreign policy. This is not just merely waiting around. And this is a massive leap from how the United States had typically thought of itself with European affairs. Now Kennan's statement of everywhere that the Soviet Union is looking to expand, the United States must have a presence there. This is a huge change in American thinking. Especially given the fact that after World War II, most Americans were under the impression that they would more or less go back to the way that it was before, that we would have a new kind of return to normalcy like we did after World War I. The second statement here, the bolded part. He notes that it's entirely possible for the United States to influence by our own actions and what happens in the United States, that we can influence what's going on inside Russia and inside kind of the international communist movement, as other countries consider going towards more authoritarian or more communist, authoritarian governments or communist economies. So we can affect what they do internally. The third stanza. It's a question of the degree to which the United States can create among the peoples of the world the impression of a country that knows what it wants and which is successfully coping with the problems of its internal life. In other words, if the world can look and see that people in the United States are wealthy, that they are healthy, that they are happy, that they more or less support the ideals of their government, then they're going to want to emulate the United States. This goes back to the early Puritan idea of the United States or America as a city on a hill, that we will be this example of which the rest of the world will want to follow. So Kennan draws upon this idea as well. The fourth section said that if the United States can successfully contain at different points around the world the Soviet Union, it's going to put added strain on the Kremlin's foreign policies. Everything is going to become more difficult and more challenging, and we'll wrap this in these final two bottom statements. The last statement that Kennan makes. Thus, the decision will really fall in large measure in this country itself. The issue of Soviet-American relations is, in essence, a test of the overall worth of the United States as a nation among nations. To avoid destruction, the United States need only to measure up to its own best traditions and prove itself worthy of preservation as a great nation, measuring up to its own best traditions. Liberty, democracy, equality, the ideals reset forth in the 14 points, in the Atlantic Charter, in the Four Freedoms speech. Kennan's rooting this idea in what is it actually that we are fighting for, just as those same things that we think we fought for in World War II and in World War I. So a summary of this, the implications of this is that every battle that takes place during the Cold War, and when I say battle, we refer to things like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, crises in the Middle East. I'd like you to view each of those as an individual battle in a larger Cold War. The implication is that the Cold War takes on, every battle of the Cold War is taking on a symbolic importance way beyond just the practical implications of that battle. So when we get to the Berlin blockade, it's not just about the people of West Berlin. It's going to be interpreted as a victory of democracy over authoritarianism. The Korean War on the Korean Peninsula, it's not just about protecting the people of South Korea from North Korean military forces. It's seen as a battle of capitalist economics compared to communist economics. Conflicts in Iran and Egypt, those are not just seen as conflicts over who's going to have access to the Suez Canal or the oil resources of the Middle East, that it's a statement of the worth and value of the countries and their systems itself. So Kennan's thought was pretty simple here, that anytime the Soviet Union attempts to expand its influence, that attempts to expand geographically and fails, it's going to be seen and interpreted around the world and within the Soviet Union as a demonstration of the weakness of their system. And that is how he thought this would play out.